I'm Drew Bronner. I'm a planner with Kimley Horn, and I'll be presenting some of the boards discussing community growth as well as travel distribution. And so what the important things to look at with community growth is to see where's the community going in terms of both households and future employment, which end up being where are people starting their trips from and where are people ending in terms of trips, to get an idea of some of the future priorities to look for in transportation. And then with travel distribution, we're looking at what are some of the travel patterns both locally and regionally, getting an idea of what are the number of trips that are happening just purely locally within Golden, as well as trips that are happening regionally, either commuting trips that are starting or ending in Golden, or trips that are purely passing through on their way to another destination. We can get an idea of that from the data that we've analyzed with this board right here.
Hi, I am Morgan Huber. I'm with Apex Design. This right here is giving us an overview of all the previous plans that the City of Golden has accomplished. In the past, plans have focused on individual neighborhoods and sub-areas of the city. This is a timeline of how long each plan has been an issue. All of these plans are available online for additional details. Tonight we're here to talk about the Transportation Master Plan. The City of Golden has some really good sidewalk coverage. About 75% of the city does have sidewalks. The city is interested in enhancing the already existing facilities as well as providing additional facilities. We want to hear from the community where are opportunities for additional sidewalks and ways to enhance the pedestrian experience.
Hi, my name is Kyle McLaughlin. I'm a planner with Kimley Horn. I'm here at the Golden Open House. The boards I'm going to be covering are a community profile, and what these are different areas of Golden and kind of what the residents do, where they go, where they work, and then is the same where the employees come from. So if we look at this is looking at North Golden, and we've got this map that kind of shows us the residents of North Golden, where they go for their jobs, and it gives us a good understanding of how those people need to be served. Similarly, on the south, or on the bottom of the board, is where people who work in North Golden, where they come from and where they live. And then this middle kind of gives us an overview of the numbers of people who come in, stay, work, and live in the same area, and then the people who are leaving for work elsewhere. So we've got the McIntyre area, we've got North Golden, downtown Golden, and then South Golden, all broken down into the 4 separate areas. We are talking about the regional reach and the modal accessibility of Golden. So regional reach kind of gives us, with Golden and the entire area of the Denver Metro, where can people get to by car and by transit mainly in 10-minute and half an hour increments. So this larger area is, if I'm in Golden, where can I get to? This one specifically is North Golden. So anywhere in this light blue is supposed to be half an hour drive from that area. And then this board gives us a local breakdown of walking, biking, and transit. So this darker area is, if I'm in North Golden, where can I walk to in 10 minutes? And then the larger blue is where can I bike to in 10 minutes? And these yellow dots give us the transit stops that are 10 minutes away from North Golden. So we've got, again, the 4 broken down areas.
Hello, I'm Troy Russ with Kimley Horn. We're helping out with the Golden Transportation Mobility Plan. The board you're looking at tonight is what we call travel demand. We looked at the roads from a vehicle capacity perspective, both today and in 2040, and we're identifying where congestion is and where we anticipate congestion to be.
Hi, I'm Molly Veldkamp. I'm with Senior Transportation Planner with Apex Design, and here to talk with you about the crash analysis that we've completed to understand a little bit more about safety in Golden. We've looked at crash data from 2012 to 2016 to understand some of the trends that are happening in Golden in terms of safety. Over the 5-year period, about 2% of the crashes have resulted in severe injury or fatalities. And we've seen that crashes have actually, the rate of growth of crashes has slowed a bit. What we really noticed when we started looking at things was the overrepresentation of severe collisions for people biking, for people walking, and for people who are impaired while they're driving. So we see for bicyclists who are involved in collisions, they represent about 3% of the actual crashes that happen in Golden, and 12% of the severe crashes. For people walking, they represent about 1% of the crashes that take place in Golden, but 5% of those severe collisions. And for people who are impaired while they're driving, they represent about 4% of the collisions, but 15% of the severe collisions. So those are places that we really want to focus on reducing that impact and really increasing safety.
Hi, I'm Josh Malem. I'm from Denver, Colorado, and I'm working with Apex Design in the city of Golden to look at their transportation master plan. And I'm focusing on bicycle connectivity and network analysis in the city of Golden. This board here is level of traffic stress, and what it basically shows is the green shows what would be comfortable for an adult to ride throughout the city, and the red shows where the barriers are, the high stress for people, so it makes them uncomfortable to ride. So you can see about 70% of Golden's road are considered low stress routes, and most people feel comfortable riding on that. Next is the existing infrastructure that Golden has, and right now they have currently about 18 miles of paved trails that really connect all the way around Golden and then into downtown Golden as well. And when the trails end, it's picked up by either bicycle lanes or signed bicycle routes. And Golden is actually considered a silver rated bicycle level community, so it's very friendly for bicycles right now. However, there are some missing areas that this plan will address, and we'll try to make it even friendlier for people of all ages and abilities to ride. And next is just kind of a board that shows what types of facilities we'll be looking at in the transportation plan. Some are just pavement markings on the road where it's a low stress facility, all the way up to protected bike lanes that's found on 19th Street as well. It was a recently built facility that is really a good connection from downtown all the way up to Beverly Heights. And that's what we'll be looking at from bicycles.
Hi, my name's Stephanie, and I am with Apex Design, and I am going to talk about some of the existing transit service that's in Golden, and I'm looking forward to hearing what the community has to say about why they take transit, or if they don't, what would make them want to take transit more. The boards here, it shows kind of the existing transit system. We have the W line, which is the light rail that comes into the Jefferson County Government Center station. And then we have a few local and regional routes as well. I've highlighted the 2 highest ridership bus stops, and we've given some examples of the type of bus stops that there are, and we would like to hear what the community has to say about that and what types of places that they feel more comfortable standing and waiting for the bus at, and which places need some improvement.
First and foremost, I'd like to say thank you to everyone for attending tonight. It is definitely December outside. It is cold, it is dark, and it was snowing a couple times today. So I truly appreciate the time that you took out of your evening to come tonight, and the fact that we got a group this large, I think, speaks large volumes to the community of Golden, and I appreciate that. Thank you. My name's Corey Miller, and I am a planner with the City of Golden. And before we begin a presentation, and I turn it over to our consultant team, I'd like to give sort of a broad description of the Transportation Master Plan and what it entails. The Transportation Master Plan itself will function more or less like the comprehensive plan for the City of Golden as it relates to land use. Except that opposed to making recommendations for projects, investments, policy, regulations as they relate to land use and zoning, this will specifically be oriented to transportation. In the past, the city has sort of focused these document efforts on specific projects or areas within transportation, and this is really the first time that we've tried to wrap everything in comprehensively. And that naturally involves a lot of work. That's why we've chosen to partner with 2 very reputable transportation consultant firms, Kimley Horn and Apex Design, who you will meet and you likely have met tonight. They're positioned around at each one of these stations. The Transportation Master Plan will be a long process. It will definitely eat into next year, and there will definitely be more opportunities for you to get involved. The purpose of tonight, as it is a kickoff meeting, it is also sort of the end of our initial data collection and our health assessment of the City of Golden, its traffic infrastructure, and its policies. Once this phase of the project is over, we'll move into the next phase, which is more of a recommendation phase for new policy, new improvements to existing infrastructure, as well as integration of new kind of mobility options and demand for new types of mobility options that may not have been included in our other planning policy documents or may have simply just not existed 5 years ago. Stuff is moving fast nowadays. So what I'd like to do now is turn it over to Mr. Troy Russ with Kimley Horn, who's going to give a presentation, sort of a 101 transportation presentation, to go over all the details for those who feel uninitiated. So again, thank you for coming, and it's all you.
Now the handoff. Good evening. Is this loud enough for you all to hear me? All right, I'll try my best without breathing on the mic at the same time. So as Corey mentioned, I'm Troy Russ. I'm with a firm called Kimley Horn. We're very fortunate to be working with you on your mobility future, so we're very excited about that. I would just like to ask the city staff as well as the consultant team to raise your hands, that if you have any questions, you know where to go to as we go through it. You met most of us around the boards, so with that, Corey did a good job sort of explaining what a mobility study is. It's a piece of the comprehensive plan, but it's the transportation focus of it. It will provide the long-term vision, the multimodal transportation vision for the city. It really functions as a reliable 5 to 7 year roadmap for transportation investments. It will be designed to incorporate new technologies in the evolving shared economy. It will outline and prioritize future transportation investments focused on improving the safety, mobility, and access for all modes of travel while minimizing congestion and its impacts. So this isn't a car study. This is a mobility study for every mode of travel in the city. It will strike a balance between community livability and mobility, and it'll be constrained to the fiscal resources of the city, right? And our mobility partners at the state. So it's really meant to help the City Council understand and prioritize their investments as it's related to your community vision. I always like to show this graphic because a lot of times when things are done in isolation, we don't create the places we want. So this is a diagram from the city of Charlotte, from the Charlotte Observer, when they were building their transit system. And they were very frustrated because the transit planners and roadway planners were not talking to land use. And they weren't on the same page, and it was an editorial reflection of the people's opinion. If transportation and land use are fighting, place suffers. Place is your home, place is where you work, place is your school, right? Land use is a very technical term. It's the zoning allowances and where you go. And transportation is obviously transportation. Until you stop fighting and actually integrate land use and transportation, the place you want to create is going to suffer. And so our focus is to focus on place. So I want to do a transportation 101 so you can sort of understand how the consultant team comes at it. So really, you have already done exceptional transportation planning. Golden is far ahead of many communities. So what we see this first phase of our effort is us to catch up. So we're sort of doing an independent audit of your transportation and land use system from a mobility perspective. And that's what you're starting to see on these boards. We're going to talk to a lot of people to understand how it's working. We're going to compare that to all the transportation plans you have. And working with you all and the city staff, we're going to then start to prioritize solutions. Where your current plans are falling from a technical perspective or community outreach, or where our ideas either work or don't. And so that's what we're going to do over the next year to help prioritize that. To do that, we want to make sure you understand our language. We need to understand your language, but you also need to understand how transportation professionals look at your city from a mobility perspective. So there's going to be lots of charts and graphs, and hopefully make them as interesting as possible. But what this is basic 101 how most roadway planners, traffic planners, car planners look at transportation planning, right? So you look at the capacity of the road, that's the vertical, and how many years over time. A 2-lane road is the purple. At a moment in time, the demand on the road and the 20-year forecast say you need to widen that road, right? So you widen the road, and that's where the purple line goes up. And we think we've solved the problem. What we have found over the last 50 years is the actual demand when you widen the road creates a phenomenon called induced travel. That's your desire to travel 10 minutes further to save 50 cents on toilet paper. We can't model that. A lot of people relocate their house on their ability to move around. We can't model that. It's called induced travel. So oftentimes when roads widen, we find that they're near capacity when they open because it doesn't match how the model works, because we can't understand induced travel and your willingness to change your behavior on how easy it is to move around. So it's called induced travel. And what we've learned over time, as we widen the road and continue to widen the road, it continues to change the behavior. So yes, we can predict where you're going to go, but we can't predict why you're going to do it. And so it gets to a moment of frustration from a traffic planning and probably a citizen perspective is, why aren't you solving this problem? Because people change based on the mobility system out there. It's sort of a vicious circle. So you get to a moment in time that the roadway can't be improved, right? This is a 6-lane arterial. The next step for this is grade separate. Transit, and which is probably unattainable from a financial perspective. From a transit perspective, transit won't work here because it's not a walkable environment. From a land use perspective, what works here? Not much. It's retail. Only retail or large-scale land uses work on high-speed roadways. So they tend to cannibalize one another. So you see the 1950s shopping center beat out by the 60s shopping center. The 1970s shopping center beat out by the 1980s shopping center. And we create an environment that really can't be improved. So what we're proposing in the city of Golden has done a really good, before we get there, transportation influences much more than land use. It influences many social statistics. So this is obesity. For the first time in human life, our kids aren't expected to outlive their adults. And it's called an obesity epidemic. Inactivity. Transportation contributes to that. It's not the cause, but it's a contributing factor. If you're walking or biking or driving, and where people live and how everyone moves around, obesity is contributed to by our mobility system. So how we design our city influences our social. It influences our economic or household statistics. This is how much your income goes to different things. Your single biggest source is housing, where your money goes to. The second biggest source is most often, this is actually Tampa, Florida. In Tampa, Florida, the second biggest thing was transportation. In some cities, transportation is number 1, and housing is number 2. So a lot of times we're struggling with affordable housing, right? The land prices are going up. How can we create an affordable situation? Sometimes a strategy ought to be, can we make affordable transportation? Because you're hitting the pocketbook. So transportation influences how much and where you live, how much it costs. It influences the cultural characteristics. I'm trying to throw humor in here too. So yes, this is a church in North Carolina. It's our Lady of the Highways Catholic Church. But their priorities, transportation really influences a lot of things. So what and how do you deal with that? Right, so this is the transportation spectrum. From 1940s until the late 80s, we really followed basically the red line. Make more room for cars. There's only 2 ways to do it. More pavement or more efficiency. More pavement is obvious, right? Wider roads are more roads. More efficiency are roundabouts, signal timing, getting more capacity of the infrastructure you already have, but it's really car focused. When communities reach a point of maturity, they actually start to move to the right on this diagram, right? Because aren't we really in the business of moving people, not just cars? So you're seeing we're now investing in transit, we're investing in bicycle facilities, we're investing in HOV facilities and walking. Those are a significant contributor to the mobility system. In addition to that, aren't we trying to improve the quality of the travel? Of course we are. Right? Neighborhoods are calling for traffic calming. Business districts are calling for streetscapes. And what we have studied is, and what we know, people are more tolerant of congestion if they're sitting in a beautiful place. So sometimes streetscapes help from a traffic perspective. If it's an ugly place, people get more frustrated by the congestion. So the quality of the trip is now more important, that you didn't see rise up in the 80s and 70s, where now we have to deal with that from a traffic perspective. Now how about the most counterintuitive? Move less people, fewer miles. Right? It's land use. Get people to live where they work. The most effective transportation solution you can have is land use. Right? And land use is creating mixtures of land uses so people can choose to walk or choose to bike based on the distance of jobs and households. Land use is a transportation strategy. And that's why land use and transportation have to work together to create the place you want to create. And then lastly, town council or the city council and you can manage expectations. Right? So roadway engineers grade roads A to F. The difference, and D is typically the line. It's not school. Yes, you can go home and say, I got a D, and traffic engineers think you'd be great. That's sort of the minimum level of service. In level service, we grade the roads A to F based on delay experienced. But if D is the minimum level of service, there's no reason City Council says, you know what, instead of D, let's go to E. With a stroke of a pen, you just added 20% capacity to the road. Roads don't break. Bridges break. Buildings fall down. Roads don't break. People can choose to go a different direction. People can choose a different time of day. So it's really a policy decision. And what you're finding in communities of place is that minimum level of service standard falls. Dealing in Portland, I was dealing with the Portland Department of Transportation engineer. He was just hoping to not have level of service F throughout the day. That was his goal, right? And it's because the solution is if you want to raise your level of service from, say, D to C, that means you typically have to widen the road. You may impact the church that's next to that road. You may impact the home or the park. And there reaches a moment in time that you simply can't do that anymore. Roads become too expensive from a social, economic, fiscal perspective. So that's why you change your level of service. So managing your expectation and not solving the problem is a big piece of transportation. So here's a thing for thought. Of your local roads, do you really want a level of service D as a minimum standard? Because the consequences of that decision could have great impact on a neighborhood. Very different than, say, a level of service D on Highway 6. So not all roads should necessarily be graded the same either. And I want you to think about that as we go forward. Some basic understandings of transportation. Two-lane streets carry more capacity than a 4-lane street, carry more cars. Counterintuitive, right? So what we know from a traffic engineering perspective is if these two diagrams have the same number of lanes, 4 lanes up and down, 6 lanes east and west, or left and right, the one on the right carries more cars. Same amount of pavement, just laid out differently. Why is that? So, got to bore you with some traffic stuff. So this is the number of cars per hour a lane of roadway carries. So the image on the left, if it's a 2-lane road, 1 lane in each direction, no left turn lane, it processes about 600 cars per hour per lane. If we add that left-hand turn lane, right, it processes about almost 900 cars per hour per lane. That's the most efficient road you can build is a 3-lane road. The moment you go larger than a 3-lane road, 4-lane or 5-lane road, it becomes less efficient. Not less capacity, less efficient per lane. The reason that is people shy away from the outside lane because we know people make right-hand turns. So that outside lane is not as efficient as the inside lane. But the biggest reason is on big roads, we have to put a protected left-hand turn arrow in. That signals. Everyone has to stop to let the left-hand turn go. Once they go, then everyone gets to move again. That robs the street of capacity. Now, when you think of this, how does this relate to land use and community character? On a 3-lane street, which is the most efficient, this is why two-lane streets carry more than a 6-lane street. Counterintuitive, but it's true. But on a 3-lane street, you can bike next to it, you can walk next to it. Almost every single land use, from residential to office, all work on 2- and 3-lane streets. When you get bigger streets, you start to restrict your ability to walk on it. You start to restrict your ability to bike on it. You start to restrict your ability for different land uses to succeed next to it. Right? Single family really doesn't like to be next to a 4-lane street or a 6-lane street. So speed or the capacity of the street people don't think of it that way and don't really think that, wow, two two-lane streets actually carry more cars than a four-lane street. Connectivity. Really important to think of why network is important, and it comes to become really relevant in Golden. This is a simple diagram that was created by DPZ. They're an architecture firm in Florida. On the left. In that diagram, they simply laid out the regional mall in red, apartments in orange, single family in yellow, and a school in green. That's how a lot of communities are made. It's sort of cul-de-sac community. They all rely on one road and how it's laid out. So what my firm did is we laid out trip assignments. We're not as exciting as architects, right? So the trip assignments are on the left, and so what traffic engineers say, what's your home-based work trip? That's your trip from home to work. Your home-based work trip. So we put it on the map, and then we show your home-based shopping trip, your recreational trip. If you notice, every single trip has to go to the same road. So that road becomes big. So the less roads you have, the bigger they get. Then we worked with DPZ on a different diagram, same land use, same exact land use, just laid out a different way. We made a connected grid. And now we did the boring engineering work. We did our trip assignments. Every last trip has a choice. They don't have to use the arterial. They could use a local street. Therefore, with more streets, the smaller they get. Fundamental. And so I know a lot of neighborhoods say we don't want this street connected. The consequence is you get bigger and bigger streets. If you have every street connected, every single street's going to be smaller. Counterintuitive, but that works. Now, why is that important from a land use perspective? Again, what land uses succeed and fail. So if you have an economic development strategy on a corridor and you're hostage to a 6-lane design because of the way you laid out your city, then you're going to be challenging yourself from a transportation perspective. And what do then traffic engineers have to do? So we did a study using Google, and it's called Streetlight. They manage Google's big data. And they take that big data and they package it so we know wherever all of you guys went for about a 4-day period back in October. We know everywhere you went, not individually, just collectively, right? So they dumbed down the data, so I don't know exactly where you went. I won't tell your wife or husband. But what we found is on those corridors, there's certain roadways that have what we call regional trips. You already know this, right? These are trips that have neither an origin or destination in Golden. They're passing through Golden. Guess which roads have the highest through trips? Anyone? Right, we all know what they are. They're 93, they're Highway 6, they're 58, and we mapped it. Now, because those longer trips have different transportation strategies than short trips. So the longer trips, if we don't have network, land use is less important, right? We have to get people from point A to point B. They're not stopping at land use, so let's just get them through town. Higher travel speeds are more important. Controlled access, limited connectivity are all more important. Walking and bicycling really aren't viable transportation alternatives for these longer trips. And then transit can be a partner. Transit is actually a good partner for longer trips. Now, if you lay out your community a different way, where you have local traffic, and this is why we studied on Golden Road and all your internal streets, there's much higher local trips. Now, there's regional and local trips on all streets, but the percentages are different. What do you do on local streets, right? Land use becomes very important. That's why you're putting traffic calming devices out there, because you're within the area. Lower travel speeds are important. Open access, right? These are the streets that actually get to your business or your home. Good connectivity, and suddenly walking, bicycling, and transit are all viable partners. Those are actual mobility options for you to choose when you look at it. So we're trying to break down your city and understanding how the local streets and regional streets work, because we have different transportation strategies for them. So that's sort of basic how roadways work in relationship to land use. Then I want to get into sort of best practices on street design. And the first thing we want to teach is speed is everything, right? So what's the speed, this graph gives it away, that you can move the most cars at any one moment in time? Between 25 and 30 miles an hour. That's the speed to which cars are closest together. because we all follow that 2-second rule, right? You keep that car 2 seconds in front of you. And so we know how many cars we can process. When you're at higher speeds, there's bigger gaps. Now that rule typically falls apart with adolescents, typically males influenced by hormones, right? Doesn't apply to them, but to most humans, that rule applies. So at 25 to 30 miles an hour, we can process the most cars. Well, at 25 to 30 miles an hour, that's very compatible with bicyclists, pedestrians. Every single land use can live or work next to a street that moves that fast. As you go faster, the gap works. So speed's kind of important to understand. That's counterintuitive. Counterintuitive. Now, speed really matters for safety, right? So this is, again, an engineering diagram. Sorry to bore you. On the left is a chart, a 30 mile an hour design speed. What we know at 30 miles an hour is we know 15% of the population will be speeding it. It's called the 85th percentile. So we study roads, do speed studies, and we set the speed limit to the 85th percentile. Typically, we know 15% of the population is speeding, typically males influenced by hormones, right? Those are what we know at speeding. Well, the way safety works in braking distance and sight lines, it's not a linear relationship, it's exponential. As you go faster, it takes a much longer time to stop. So what do we do when we're on a road with a curve and there's a lot of crashes, or if there's a road with a hill? It's sight lines, it's a horizontal curve or a vertical. We try to flatten that road or straighten it out so you can see farther, right? So you can see the driveway that's now hidden behind the hill, we'll flatten it so we can see that driveway so you can prepare for that conflict. That's what traditional roadway safety does. Well, when you flatten or straighten a road, it speeds the traffic up because you can see farther. So what happens is it raises the speed limit, right? You suddenly go from 30 to 40 miles an hour, yet still magically 15% of the population is still speeding. But the difference between a crash at 30 miles an hour versus a crash at 40 miles an hour is severe. What we know, and you may not like what I'm about to say, is if you hit 100 people at 20 miles an hour, you're only going to kill 4. That's pretty good. If you hit those same 100 people at 35 miles an hour, you're going to kill 83 of them. Speed matters. Speed is everything. So this is where traffic calming is. Instead of flattening the hill or straightening the road to deal with that driveway, put a roundabout or an island in the road so people can approach that driveway at a speed to which they could react to that car coming out in front of them. So they're both completely legitimate safety strategies. Typically, the higher speed strategies are on higher speed roads, like interstates. Interstates are the safest roads in the world. Unfortunately, a lot of roadway engineers follow interstate standards on local streets. They don't work on local streets. Traffic calming and slowing, which is just as effective safety strategy to prepare the motorists for the obstacles that are in front of them. So traffic calming is actually a high safety yield. So looking at the road, where do you do safety strategies to increase speed for mobility purposes? Where do you slow it down? That's a part of this study as well. Land use matters. So this is the classic diagram of why transit doesn't work. Each of us in your soul probably agree with this. This is a US patient, has a rash of cars. The doctor is trying to prescribe to him the transit pill. And the patient says, transit pill, no thanks, doc. I'll live with cars a little bit longer. Right? So why is he saying that? Or any of you saying that? The thing is, they can't imagine walking to transit in the environment that we've created. Right? And land use dictates the environment we create. Transit needs you to walk or bike to it to be successful, either at the origin end or the destination end, right? So how we look at trips matters. So mixed use environments, having people live closer to where you work. Why does land use and transit work so importantly? Again, to bore you with traffic, we have things called trip ends. Your home-based work trip has one trip end, from home to work and then work back. There's 2 ends of the trip. So what we know is based on, if we have 3 destinations, there's 6 trips, 1 on each end. Now, if those destinations are all spread apart, you're driving to each one of them. So you're putting 6 trips onto the road. If we can just simply put them within a walking distance of one another, those same land uses arranged differently takes 2/3 of the trips off the road. So land use matters. Density matters in terms of how many trips are on the road. So this is a simple example of, I just showed you about density and creating mixed-use environments. This one doesn't do anything like that. So we have to ask our architect friends to do stuff that's cool. So this is a townhome in Johnson City, Tennessee. I wanted to illustrate a point. There's a subdivision wall. Right across the street to the right of this image is a park. No one was using it. I said, why? Because they had to cross a 4-lane street, right, to get there. But what if we had different design standards and said in same density, the townhomes would still be there, but you actually don't allow the wall to be built. You put the doors on the street. And then a part of that, you actually have a streetscape standard. Now you can actually imagine, instead of walking around that wall to the park, they could actually cross the street to get there. Suddenly transit, you go back from this environment, no density change, right? There is no density. If transit were that Chevy, who's going to use it, right? You have to actually get there. That wall, there's no way to get there from that wall. Oops. Suddenly you can see people riding transit on that corridor. So it's not necessarily density. It's how you arrange your land uses to make walking, bicycling, or transit actually work. So a lot of planners like mixed-use environments, and they like putting the buildings up to the street. This is why, right? It gives every mode of travel a chance. If you have the other option, you're kind of stuck. You're saying to the world, cars are the only way to move around, right? Transportation can't solve this, land use can. Anyway. Moving on to the last sort of pieces of this, pedestrian facilities. We like this one. This is a traffic engineer. I was actually on vacation in Moab, Utah, and I was reading the paper, and this popped out in the local paper. And that's, we lost the top. It says, UDOT, Utah Department of Transportation, recalibrates its signal lights. That's what it says in the black. You can't see it. And so the engineers there is testing the pedestrian. Can you get across faster, right? Some marginalizing the pedestrians so the cars have more green time. So it's just it was an editorial in Moab on their feelings of how Utah Department of Transportation were treating their pedestrians. Not very fairly. So there's basic elements from a pedestrian facility design you need to know. In a sidewalk, there's 3 components. There's the shy. And the shy is what's adjacent to the building or the fence. No one uses that space because they don't want to rub across the fence. So every pedestrian naturally shies away from the building. Then the walkway. So a lot of times we have a 5-foot walkway, and that's standard ADA minimum. Not minimum, desired. 4 foot is minimum. But that's the walkway. That's where you actually walk. And a lot of times our roadway or sidewalk standards only require a 5-foot sidewalk. They kind of forget about the shy, so they're undersized immediately. And then we have the furnishing zone. So that's just the basic language for pedestrians. Crosswalks, thought I'd throw a palm tree on a winter night, so just to make you feel warm. This is West Palm Beach. This is what we call a directional crosswalk. It's not a radial crosswalk. A radial crosswalk comes out on the corner. My mouse isn't working, but the radial crosswalk comes out here. The directional ones come here. ADA allows both, but the desired are directional crosswalks. Why is that important from a pedestrian safety perspective? If I'm a pedestrian standing right here and I want to cross the street, when does this car actually see me? Versus if I want to cross here, when does the car actually see me? So I hear pedestrians all the time saying, the cars don't stop, the cars don't stop. And you ask yourself, did they even see me? And the odds are, the way we laid out our street or designed our corners, you can't blame the motorist. They didn't see them. Because I think if we see pedestrians, 98% of us in the room or 99% of us in the room would stop. Because it's the law and we understand that. Again, males influenced by hormones you don't know about. But the way we lay out our sidewalks and crosswalks make either pedestrians or cyclists visible or not in how we lay them out. Lastly, from a bicycle perspective, the entire world has changed over the last 5 years on how we treat cyclists. You're going to see a diagram that Josh put together with Apex on what we call comfort level on cycling. What we know is there's generally three types of cyclists, the A, B, and C. The A is what we've designed the traffic for before. It's the spandex lobby. Those are the guys that are racing up Lookout Mountain. My brother's one of them, right? And we typically, historically, design bike facilities for them, yet we haven't seen an increase in bicycling. Over the last 5 to 8 years, we've seen a revolution in bicycling. And what we see, Denver is a great example of it. We've seen huge increases in cycling because they started protecting their bicycle facilities. Either putting, this is called a cycle track. It's a bicycle track or bicycle facility path that runs parallel to the road, and it's independently separated. So I'm showing, I'm going anywhere from Milan, Italy to New York to Denver. We have buffered and protected bike lanes. Instead of having just the stripe on the side of the road, right, now they're starting to try to at least to separate the bike facility in the upper right from the road with an actual gap so a cyclist feels more comfortable. But better yet, can we create physical barriers? So in downtown Denver on Lawrence and Arapahoe, right, they have on-street parking actually protects the bicycle facility. What we've seen in Denver is a 35% increase in cycling because they're now actually creating facilities that the B and C cyclists, normal people that don't like to wear spandex every day, they're using the facilities too. So how we lay out our facilities, so you're sort of going to get state of the art. So we've measured the comfort level of your facilities, and we're going to make recommendations so that everyone feels comfortable cycling on it as a part of the plan. And then lastly, I want to talk about everyone says, what are you going to do about autonomous vehicles? Don't know, right? I'll just be honest, right? So let's think about what autonomous vehicles in the shared economy, right? The shared economy means bicycles, scooters, cars, they're now available for me to use on demand, right? I don't need my own, right? So what does that mean to roadways? And honestly, we haven't got our arms around it. But what we do sort of have expectations, and that's in the top of the screen, we expect a safer environment, right? With smarter vehicles, better communication between those vehicles, we expect it to be a safer environment. We expect more efficient roads, as cars will be able to travel closer together because they won't be influenced by hormones. We'll have a lower car ownership because now you have mobility choices, right? You can scoot, you can share a car instead of own your own car. We expect lower parking demands, quite frankly, as we're going forward. We expect lower cost transit, for the cost of the driver is no longer a part of it. We expect lower cost freight. We expect our curbs and our sidewalks to have huge demand that we haven't really understood yet. The fears are, well, now are people going to travel more because it's easier? That's a real fear that we have to get our hands around. Are we going to see increased in freight trips, so more trucks on the road? Probably, right? That's a fear. Are we going to see lower use of alternative modes, right? So we're going to actually see people taking an Uber instead of taking a bus. We're starting to see that, right? So that's a fear in this. The unknowns that you need to think about, are we suddenly going to create an environment that we have deliberate trips and not spontaneous trips? And that's really important to think about. So a lot of motorists or pedestrian cyclists, when you're going somewhere, you have a trip. It's called a formal exchange. You're going to that restaurant. And so from a city term, you're exchanging goods and services at that restaurant. The best cities in the world have what we call informal exchange. That's on the way to the restaurant, you see a friend. And you stop on the sidewalk or you pull over on the road and you talk to them. Or you see a business that you never saw before and you wanted to go there. So what the shared economy as land use planners and economic planners are really starting to worry about is that deliberate trip. So if I'm in an autonomous vehicle, is it going to take me to that restaurant and I won't see or experience, because I'm not paying attention, that new business that's in between? And so what does that do to our land use? Right? So those are the things we think about. But I want to sort of put it all in perspective. Right? So this is showing new scooters, shared economies, pedestrians on this. There's a lot of demands on our curbs. There's always been a lot of demands on their curbs. It used to be, let's tie the horse to that curb. Right? And so what cities need to do is define what they want. And the shared economy is going to respond to it. So it's really not necessarily worrying about that autonomous vehicle. We clearly need the fiber optics and the infrastructure to let that work. But from a city experience perspective, We need to prioritize how our curbs are used. Are we going to use it for transit? Are we going to use it for a bike lane or sidewalk? Are we going to use it for on-street parking? Are we going to use it for car share and have loading zones? Are we going to do it for a docking station for a bike share situation or a scooter share? Right? Come up with your priorities on how you manage that curb and what's important. If it's a whole bunch of restaurants, maybe we reserve that space for sidewalk cafes. Right? And so we just have to get smarter with how we deal with the curbs. It's not anything we haven't already done. Just putting the shared economy in perspective in terms of prioritize what you want from a land use perspective. So that was a lot. That was kind of a Transportation 202. And so that's our language on how we're going to be looking at your city. And we want to have that engagement. So Corey already went over our schedule. Right now, we're going to do an independent audit of what your system is doing. We're going to compare that with what you think it is doing, as well as all the plans that you have, and then we're going to come back together in the late spring and identify solutions. We're all going to agree that certain ideas have been fantastic, and we'll probably all agree other ideas weren't great. And we're going to reshuffle the deck and say, how do you spend your money? And are the roadway improvements more important than bike or not? Right? And we're going to give City Council, with your input, guidance on how do you prioritize your transportation investments. So that is the presentation. It was a little bit long. I'd love to have a conversation. We're here until 8. So the boards are here to talk, but maybe we have an open, sort of an open house format and have a conversation. How do you react to this? What are your thoughts? What are your challenges for us to address? Anyone want to start off? Yes.
I mentioned this to you earlier, and it is a part, well, it is kind of a transportation plan, but it was in the paper today where they're putting out the bids for W470, and that, of course, they want to funnel that right through Golden. So the town has been very, very concerned about that.
And rightfully so.
And how that's going to impact our town, because it's going to impact it very negatively in many, many ways. And how are we going to handle that?
That is one of our assignments, is what are the regional decisions that are being made, and how does it influence the town?
Can you make sure you repeat?
I'm sorry. There was concerns on the Jefferson Parkway, and a recent article, was it today, that portions of it are going out to bid. Is this still on?
RFPs.
RFPs to go out to bid. Right, so the bid is the beginning process of construction. So her concerns was that's going to have dramatic impact on the city of Golden. I think we all agree. So we need to come up with a strategy to deal with it. Obviously, what do we do on 93, US 6? How do we start to strategize on Ford and Washington and some of the internal roads? That's a major part of this study. Yes, sir.
What's our plan for getting pedestrians, cyclists, and cars from downtown Golden on the 10th corridor, 41st Street corridor to the new train?
That's a great question, and I'll have Josh help out. We've done accessibility studies. It's interesting. The South Golden, the Jefferson County Government Center.
They're not real good bicycles.
No, when you look at it, it has great transit access to the region, but some of the poorest transit connections to the city or walking or cycling. And so Josh led a study, and Molly, on the bicycle comfort level. And so we're going to be assessing and saying, is that a priority? Because we don't know the answer yet. We're just testing, but we agree that there's a major gap there. And do we
level cyclists are long.
Exactly. How do we connect to light rail from a bike perspective is this gentleman's concern. Yep. So if everyone heard that, he's concerned, how do we actually get to light rail from a walking and bicycling perspective from the rest of the town? There's sort of a big gap. In our studies, and I don't know if Josh, you want to jump in, because I know you looked at the comfort level on the city. Are there gaps between the Taj or light rail and the rest of the city? Our reach analysis said there was.
There is, yeah.
Yep. So is that a priority to you all to make bicycle and ped connections to light rail?
Yes.
There's nodding.
Chiming in on that, there's also a great difference between daytime and nighttime. We have seen people who mistakenly took the light rail to the end of the line at the Taj Mahal late at night, stranded. The regular bus transit system stops at 6 o'clock. They were mighty grateful that some local just happened to be driving in that area.
So transit and transportation professionals call that the first and last mile. The transit gets you to a point, but how do you get to your final destination? Traditionally, it's been by foot, but we need to look at how to better connect that light rail system into the city of Golden. Yes, ma'am?
Well, you're talking about light rail. Is there any thought of modifying the W line so that it isn't so slow? You can actually get to downtown Denver faster on the Colfax Limited bus.
Really? Okay. Well, Molly, I know you looked at transit, and we're not going into the operations of the light rail, of the W line. That's beyond the scope of this. We're trying to at least get you there, but we're working with RTD can share that information.
Yeah, as far as I know, RTD doesn't have any plans to modify the W line at this time, but you can capture that comment.
It would be fabulous if they could make like every other train stop at every other station. Because now why bother to get there?
Yep. You, sir.
I missed some of your presentation, but you're doing a lot of deliveries nowadays. Is that including drone delivery?
I don't think we scoped drone delivery as a part of that, but we can raise the issue and say, how do we start to address it? But what we do know is freight's going to be increasing more and more in the city as on-time delivery and everyone desires Amazon. Is there a detailed freight study a part of it? We're just simply not at that level yet.
Hey, Troy?
Yeah. Why don't you start, so I don't have to repeat, just hold it close.
Okay. We're just wondering, since Golden's got like a crossroads kind of element with 93, 58, Highway 6, the Canyon, Colfax, I-70. I mean, there aren't a lot of communities of this size that have that many major roadways going through them.
Right.
How can that be mitigated? Or how can this community be mitigated from all those traffic impacts?
I want to just sort of verify. So we used big data from Streetlight using everyone's cell phone, so it's actually how people travel through Golden. Drew, do you mind looking at your Streetlight data and just saying in the generalized table, how many people are passing through the city versus local, the actual data of all the trips in the city?
Yep, so of all the trips throughout a 24-hour period, 30% of trips pass through just from another destination outside the city to somewhere else outside the city. 24% of those are pure trips within the city of Golden. They're going from somewhere within to somewhere else. And then 46% are commuting to or from a destination within Golden.
So 30% is not a high number when you compare to other communities of cut-through traffic. You have a lot of regional facilities that it feels that that's a high percentage coming through. The difference is you don't have a lot of destinations west of you compared to, say, a Wheat Ridge, right? So people who want to get to Lakewood from Denver, they go through Wheat Ridge. So 30% isn't high. I don't want to mitigate that. There is a strategy to deal with those through trips differently than the local trips, and we need to do that to address that 30% because we don't want it to be a negative on your community. Right? And so I hear you loud and clear. I just want to give you a perspective what other cities are dealing with.
Well, maybe it's not just traffic, but it's the use. So the use of land in Golden, there's a lot of land use to highways.
Yes.
And so that element,
Yeah.
regardless of how it's used, I mean, it's just
Yeah.
kind of a challenge.
You're absolutely right. Yes, sir.
Does your study differentiate between trips made by electric vehicles versus conventional vehicles, either in terms of the environmental benefits associated with electric vehicles or the infrastructure required for gas stations versus charging stations?
So the question is, how are you differentiating the use of electric vehicles? No, we're not. That's a very fine-grained analysis of how you break that down. Right now, we're trying to understand the vehicle. How many cars? What are we doing to accommodate that? The fueling stations is not at a level of this study. I think what will come out of this study is working with council and staff is how do we measure the success of the transportation system? Is air quality a metric? And we can model and say how much CO2 comes in or out, but you're talking at a fine grain that a larger citywide transportation study can't dive into specifics, but we can outline what's important to you and how we can measure the transportation system. So in hearing, it's a question back to you, Ken, in hearing what you're saying, would a measure of success of the transportation see a decrease over time in CO2 emissions?
Yes.
Right, and so that's the type of thing, if that's what you meant by electric vehicles, because there could be other nuances, because I know you brought up fueling stations as well. Yeah.
Hey Troy, this is...
Okay.
Oh, I can talk loud. What kind of impact does law enforcement play into improving safety, multimodal usage overall? How does it change behavior among, the speeding, reckless driving, and is that sustainable?
And I was about what does enforcement do to relate it to the roads? It's one of the E's in the engineering, but what we have found is it's kind of a Band-Aid. Because if you have the geometric, so we look at roadways from a geometric perspective, and that's the curb, the lane widths, is there on-street parking or not? And then we call it environment. So that's the buildings, the trees, and everything outside of the road. And when we have geometrics that don't match the environment, we have problems. So if we have high-speed or geometrics in low-speed environments, like main streets or neighborhoods, you tend to get bad behavior, and that's where enforcement can help. But until the geometrics get fixed, you're just as good as when the police are there. And that may not be the best use of that resource. So I think over time is to get the geometrics to match the environment that we want, so we don't have to put a police officer out there and they can go do, quite frankly, something more important than sit in their car and wait for someone to do a bad thing. Right? We'd rather out them doing that. So it's an effective tool, but it's not sustainable over time.
Okay. Yeah, that'll help over in the meantime until those plans come into place.
Because it takes a while to change the geometrics. Right? It takes time. Yes, ma'am.
Troy, since you've worked at a lot of different communities and cities across the U.S., I'm curious if you know examples of other cities, sort of the size of Golden, who have set, like what Ken said, who have set certain, objectives, not just efficiency and doing sort of the same again, but for example, we want to get 30% of the transit into, off the road and off fossil fuel vehicles, or, goals like that.
A lot of cities are coming up with standards that are not traditional engineering. So traditional engineering is level of service or ridership, but they actually have performance-based measures. And so there are cities, Boulder, one of them, and I know Boulder's 5 times the size of Golden, but a lot of cities have, let's have a goal in 20 years of increased ridership or increased accessibility. And so what coverage is how much of the city is covered. So one of the maps back here shows you the McIntyre area has 0 transit. So ridership is one thing and a goal for ridership, which a lot of cities have. But maybe you also say from a coverage perspective, are we actually covering the service with transit? So ridership can even have a chance. And so a lot of cities both have ridership measures and goals of increasing over time. A lot of cities like to reduce VMT, vehicle miles of travel, over time, decrease CO2 emissions over time. So a lot of cities of this size that mostly communities of place, kind of like Golden is. I mean, Golden is a rich community of place. And those are the communities that are peers. So part of this, in our research, we'll start to say, hey, this is what Louisville's doing, which is the exact same size, or another community from outside the country. But a lot of communities have non-traditional engineering measures. Any other sort of questions? What I want to do is we'll probably take about 8 more minutes of this, and then we'll break up and go back to the boards. And then you can talk to any one of our city staff or consultants about any subject matter. But we'll sort of keep this going for another 4 to 8 minutes. Yes, ma'am.
I have 2 questions.
Hold on.
So in other communities that you've worked with RTE and such programs, have you had a pretty good relationship in negotiating with them? Because historically they don't negotiate with Golden very well. We're kind of the redneck stepchildren of the RTE system. That's the first question.
The question is relationship with RTE. RTE is a regional partner, and their job is regional transit. And Molly has an excellent relationship with RTE, but the reality is they are meant to get people from Lakewood to Denver or Boulder down to Parker. They're a regional transit agency. What we're finding is Boulder, Denver are really supplementing the conversation with local enhancements. It's nothing against RTD. They're being asked to do a lot, and if we need to have some empathy for them, and the moment you show empathy for them, you get a better response. So we were successful in Louisville. I was the planning director there of enhancing a couple of transit service and rerouting buses to better serve some new affordable housing. We were able to do, but you've got to recognize their job is a very different job than a lot of the questions we're asking. So we need to just be empathetic for that.
My other question is the street light study that he was giving us statistics on. Sorry.
Yeah.
Do those numbers include people that dodge off of 6th Avenue or Highway 93 and go straight up 4th Street or straight up Washington
Right.
when it's not a construction zone? Because when traffic is bad, that's historically what they do. They
Right.
dodge up those two main arterial roads. And
So the question was, did the street light data get the cut through traffic or diverting onto the smaller streets? It got every trip. So anyone with a cell phone, and most of us have them, it got it. And so yes, it did it. Now, it was only for a period of time. So if there was a moment where there was construction in June, we didn't get that. Our data was October. So, but it was a pretty good sample. There was a question in the back. Yes, sir.
Just a question about like pedestrian crossways in the middle of the street. How does that affect the flow of traffic, and are they an efficient way for getting people around, or is it a...
So the question was related to Henry Barnes, who is a civil engineer in Denver, who sort of patented the Barnes dance. And so Denver used to allow pedestrians to cross diagonally across the street, and they shut down all the phases. And they called it a Barnes dance, not because everyone likes to dance in there. Henry Barnes, a civil engineer, did that. And then he went on to Chicago and New York and introduced it there as well. But it actually started here in Denver. So the question was, is that good or bad? The answer is it depends. Right? In some situations, Denver got rid of it because what we found is it robbed the street of green time in all directions. And so you'd shut down the street, and so where the city of Denver wanted to put a bike lane in and take some capacity out of the road, the signal was preventing it because we had to give everything to the PED. And so what they did in Denver, several reasons, they went from a 3-car train to a 4-car train, and they needed more time for that train to get through the intersection. But they also wanted to put bike lanes and take some streets back. And in some situations, it's helpful for the pedestrians if it's a heavy pedestrian district. In other situations, it's not such a great idea because it's not helping the other movement. So the answer, unfortunately, is it depends. In the back.
So of your deliverables, I mean, are you going to see anything that's drastic? I mean, our community has been torn apart by roundabout discussions and single track sidewalk discussions. What flavors are we going to see of new things to come that we haven't seen before that have been very opinionated in other communities?
I'm not sure we're going to be introducing anything significantly new to what the community hasn't already been talking about. Maybe some of the bicycle facility types are going to be introduced to further enhance the B&C cyclists to use the system. That may be new, but you guys are pretty advanced. I think what my goal is to set up a policy framework so those discussions on the controversial roundabout or anything else is put in perspective to the larger community good so you understand it better. Because a lot of times what we found in these transportation projects is they're not sort of prioritized and put in perspective, and it becomes an individual neighborhood against a system, and it's not communicated on why it's being put in effectively citywide. And the conversation becomes very isolated, Our hope is to have a document that the entire community is blessed, that you at least get perspective. A lot of councils look for what we call consent, or consensus, and you never get it in that situation. What we're thinking this policy framework would be what we call informed consent. So at least you may not like it, but you understand why it's going in. And there's certain trade-offs to it. So I think that's the bigger advance, because quite frankly, your staff is some of the best in the Front Range, and you have some of the coolest transportation facilities in the city. How do you continue to have the community understand if they're good or not? And we need to voice back to staff. If certain things aren't great, we'll be able to, as a community, to voice that back. But the goal, from my perspective, I'd love to hear Molly's goal, because Molly, or Josh and Molly might not be hearing me right now. I'm putting her in a spot. But the goal is, my perspective, is to have a community framework so those controversial decisions, council can actually come out of it with a positive direction. So that's the consultant's perspective. I want to ask the city to respond to that as well. Maybe Corey or Rick, in terms of what the big changes, but that's sort of my hope.
Just briefly, this is a document that's supposed to represent the entire city, so we won't be getting down on the micro level, but what our goal as the city is to get the tools to delve down into that micro level. Once this framework is in place, it gives us some guidance, it gives us some things to work with, and improve some of those specific situations that I know all of you probably have in your own minds at this moment.
Yep. So we'll take two more and then sort of break back out to the boards.
I'll talk about.
Thank you.
Nice presentation, was very clear, thank you. It seemed to be really focused on roadway use or directly next to roadway use.
Yep.
The one thing Golden has that's beautiful is open space access. Will this study look at increasing access from the city to our open space parks that would increase bicycle, walking traffic to get to the city, but through an open space area?
Right. So the reason my presentation was roadway based is it's what the city controls, and this what I call the bone structure of the community. And once you get the bones right, transit, bike, and ped work. If you don't get the bones right in the first place, it makes transit, bike, and much harder. And so get the bones right first is why that presentation was. It wasn't the scope of the project, right? So we are working with recreational staff both in the city and the county as stakeholders. Are we going to say increase access to open space or not? I'm not going there. We're going to look at the mobility of the community, and is open space or recreational trails going to be talked about and investigated? Absolutely. And we'll let the community decide on how to use those recommendations or not. So one more. Anyone? All right, yes, sir.
So in looking at the entire transportation grid, one of the concerns that I have is around the high school, where when the infrastructure was built, there were 1,100 students, 100 staff. We're going to be almost 1,500 staff and students next year. And with walkers, skateboarders, bicyclists, people who've only had their driver's license for a day, buses, all of that converging at one time, twice a day.
Right.
How do we look at creating a safer way for students and parents and commuters to get through the high school area? So that would be the only thing that I'd like to see addressed.
Okay. So we are working at what we have stakeholder interviews in partnership, and we're setting up meetings with the school district and the principals to at least learn more about that. Are we going to come up with a specific strategy for the high school? No. Are we going to come up with a framework so how the staff can go forward with a study at the high school? Absolutely. Are we going to identify if there's a big safety? A lot of times schools, there's emotion. So we want to verify that emotion against the data. And so you'll see a crash analysis that the city actually has out here. And near misses are never reported, so I understand that. So we're going to be working with the community. If there is a big problem out there from a community perspective, we're certainly going to try to give a deeper framework to how to address each of the modes that are dealing with it. But we're specifically talking to schools and the principals to better understand. And then I think these community forums will help us better understand that too. I said one more. All right.
Will we, the public, have an opportunity to participate and sit in and listen to your various meetings with stakeholders, with city staff, throughout the whole process, or do we have to wait for their time?
No, we have a couple of public meetings and investigations, both from a stakeholder focus group perspective. So we're recruiting, and I know, Corey, I might be speaking out of line, residents of the various areas of the city to participate in the focus group, stakeholder interviews in January. And so that's one forum, as well as public forum. This meeting, you're going to hear us talk the most. And we're going to kind of go silent, and we're going to listen way more after this. We wanted to present the language and this initial data, but then we're going to be working with you in the workshops where we're listening a lot more than talking.
Thanks. If I can speak to that a little bit, I've been trying to contact individuals who might be interested in participating in some direct stakeholder engagements. I do not have very many names, so I think what I would like to do, if you're interested in that, I'm going to take one of the sign-in sheets and I'm going to split it up between north neighborhoods and south neighborhoods. Each have very different issues as it's related to transportation, so we would like to hear from each group individually. If you think that you would like to be a representative of either one of those groups, please come sign in and provide your contact information, and I'll be blasting out some emails to potentially invite you to participate in the early parts of next year. I think we're trying to target the end of January for these meetings or the beginning of February. But if it does fall into a time frame that you cannot participate but you would like to just because of scheduling, because we're hoping to do these during the day, and I know everybody works, we will definitely keep an open door policy to where if you can't meet one of those meetings, you can come in, you're invited to speak with us, we can sort of regurgitate the topics and the discussion points that were made during those meetings, and we can definitely add them to the collective of comments and provide them to the consultant. So I'll leave that sign-up sheet at that table that you signed in at.
And if you participate in the community's website, we have every comment you make to the project, we read and we engage in. So that is, we're always accessible that way in terms of understanding specific issues as well. So with that, I just want to maybe have Molly remind me where the boards are to help guide them for these last 30 minutes if the community wants to go back to the boards to better understand them.
Sure. So many of you guys have already made your way through, but for those of you who haven't, if you want, I'll start here because I'm right here. If you want to talk about transit, come up here. If you want to talk about people walking, people bicycling, some safety stuff over by Josh. And then we have some more of that information about how people are currently traveling with the streetlight data and some of the mobility reach that Troy was talking about across the back wall. So we look forward to talking to you guys.
Thank you.